Welcome to Truth Behind History. Today we are diving into China's reform era, township enterprises, SEZs, and incentives, bottom-up experiments versus top-down targets. Here's what you'll get in this episode. We'll start with the late Mao economy and ask a simple question: what kind of rules produce chronic shortages even when people work hard? Then we'll watch how small, local experiments flipped incentives and triggered big productivity gains. We'll follow township enterprises that behaved like owners without officially being private, and we'll step inside the special economic zones to see how a few square miles of new rules rewired expectations nationwide. Along the way, we'll track the dual-track pricing system, the cadre promotion game, and the fiscal reforms that pulled power back to the center and pushed local governments toward land finance and leverage. By the end, you'll have a clear, evidence-based map for how rules, especially monetary and political ones, quietly shape behavior and outcomes over time. Now, slide 1, Late Mao economic inheritance. Picture an economy organized like a giant checklist. At the top, ministries set output targets. Below them, vertically integrated state enterprises and people's communes try to meet those targets with whatever inputs they can get. Prices? Mostly administrative. Credit? Mostly allocated, not discovered. And because targets, not profits, decide success, factories learn a dangerous habit: if you overspend, the state often bails you out. Economists call that a soft budget constraint. I'll translate: if failure doesn't really punish you, you're not careful with costs, quality, or innovation. Why chase efficiency if the plan guarantees you coal, steel, and wages anyway? Daily life reflected these rules. Imagine waiting in a ration line with coupons for grain or cloth. You have money, but money doesn't matter if the shelves are empty. That's the paradox of a shortage economy. People have nominal purchasing power, but goods don't appear because prices aren't allowed to rise to clear markets, and producers aren't rewarded for meeting real demand. Think of it like trying to organize a giant potluck where a central planner assigns who brings what, but the assignments ignore local knowledge. You end up with 10 trays of the wrong dish and none of what people actually want. At the village level, agriculture ran through communes and brigades. Work points replaced direct pay. Output went into collective stores, families received rations after quotas. The signal that matters, keep more of the extra grain you produce, was muffled. You can feel the incentive problem: when your marginal effort barely changes your family's share, extra effort fades. It's not laziness, it's arithmetic. Inside factories, the structure was similar. State-owned enterprises got inputs from the plan and shipped outputs back to the plan. Managers hit quantity targets to earn political credit, even if the goods were the wrong type, late, or low quality. If a machine broke, repairs might wait on an allocation slip, not a quick purchase, because the budget line wasn't theirs to flex. The People's Bank of China, serving as a window of the plan, funneled credit according to policy priorities rather than decentralized assessments of risk and return. The result was predictable: investment crowded into favored sectors regardless of whether customers were actually signaling demand. Here's a helpful way to think about it. Prices are like traffic lights. In late Mao China, many lights were frozen on green for some lanes and red for others, regardless of the actual traffic. Goods piled up where red lights were stuck, other lanes sped through empty intersections. And because the police, our metaphor for planners, could issue special passes, well-connected drivers always found a way through, while the system as a whole stayed jammed. Now, none of this means people weren't working hard or that engineers didn't care. They did. The problem was that the rules tied their hands. With administrative prices below market clearing levels, shortages became normal. With politically chosen targets, factories produced to satisfy superiors rather than customers. With soft budgets, the cost of mistakes drifted to the state, which really means to everyone, later, often via inflation or hidden rationing. So as we start this story, hold on to one big idea. When decision rights and residual rewards are separated, when the person making the choice doesn't keep much of the gain or bear much of the loss, you get behaviors that look irrational on the surface but are perfectly rational within the rules. Fix the rules, and people don't suddenly become better, they respond differently. And that is the seed of everything that follows. December of 1978. Same country, same people, but a quiet change of operating system. The third plenum of the 11th Central Committee doesn't publish a glossy blueprint for a market economy. Instead, it does something subtler and, in some ways, more radical. It rewrites the rule about rules. It says, in effect, we will allow experiments. We will judge them by results. And we won't require the entire country to move in lockstep before we try them. Think of it like this. If the late Mao economy was a single, rigid software build, the plenum pushed an update that enabled plugins. Local leaders could pilot new practices under political cover, and if they worked, others could copy them. If they failed, the center could say, that was only a trial. This is the famous image of crossing the river by feeling for stones. You don't leap. You test your footing, one careful step at a time. Why would a revolutionary system embrace incrementalism? Incentives. The center wanted growth, stability, and legitimacy without openly admitting that many old methods were underperforming. Experiments created upside without forcing a public showdown with orthodoxy. For county and township officials, the message was equally clear: if you can raise output, incomes, or revenue without creating political trouble, you'll be rewarded. Not always with money at first, but with status, safety, and sometimes promotion. That's a very strong signal. Notice the design choice here. Ambiguity wasn't a bug. It was the feature. By not defining everything in advance, the center preserved discretion. It could authorize a pilot in one province, watch the numbers, and then either scale it or quietly shelve it. That flexibility reduced the political cost of reversal and encouraged bolder local bets than a rigid, all-or-nothing reform decree ever could. What did this look like on the ground? Cadres began asking pragmatic questions. Can we let a village keep more of the extra grain if they exceed the quota? Can a factory sell marginal output at a negotiated price after it meets plan obligations? Can we invite a foreign firm into a fence zone and test different tax and land use rules? Each of those questions is small. Together, they change the metabolism of an economy. There was also a shift in what counted as evidence. Numbers, yields, output, local revenue started to matter more than slogans. If a county's trial raised living standards and didn't produce social disorder, it earned protection. If a trial generated chaos or graft that embarrassed higher-ups, it died quickly. That selection mechanism is not a free market, but it does mimic a market's habit of rewarding what works and eliminating what doesn't. Of course, there were risks. Ambiguity lets good ideas through, but it also lets opportunists game the system. Still, compared to the old target culture, this new rule about rules did one crucial thing. It reattached, even if loosely, results to rewards. And once people see that better decisions can produce visible, locally retained gains, the appetite for further experimentation grows. That appetite is the engine that will drive the next steps in our story. Let's go to the countryside, late 1970s into the early 1980s. The landscape looks the same: terraced fields, communal tools, work teams, but something quiet begins to shift at the contract table. Instead of the brigade telling every household exactly what to do and then pooling the harvest, families sign contracts to farm specific plots. They promise to deliver a quota at a fixed price. Everything above that quota? They keep. Not a slogan. A contract. And with that single change, effort begins to matter at the margin again. Why does that matter so much? Imagine pushing a boulder up a hill with 10 neighbors, and no matter how hard you push, everyone gets the same slice of bread at the end of the day. You're still a good neighbor, but on the second day, you probably push a little less. Now imagine a rule that says, after the group meets the minimum, any extra distance you move the boulder translates into bread your family can actually eat. Suddenly, you're looking for a better path, you're repairing your tools at night, and you're harvesting at the hour when the grain is sweetest. The same person, the same field, different rules. New energy. Under the Household Responsibility System, HRS, households lease land collectively owned by the village, but the right that matters is the residual claim on extra output. That right doesn't require a perfect market or formal land titles. It requires clarity after the quota. You bring in more grain, you don't hand all of it back to the collective. You keep the marginal bushels. That residual is a powerful teacher. Farmers begin experimenting with seed varieties, planting times, fertilizer mixes, and even small drainage improvements because the benefits are no longer diluted across the entire commune. The numbers that come next are not subtle. Grain yields jump, rural incomes rise. And something else happens that isn't initially visible on a chart: time frees up. When the harvest improves and the ration line shortens, households have spare labor hours. Young adults start cottage industries, repair shops, small food processing, brick kilns. The village that once had only fields now hums with side businesses. That surplus labor, released by higher farm productivity, becomes the raw material for rural industry. Let's pause on the arithmetic behind this. Under collective farming, the implicit tax on extra effort was extremely high because the surplus was widely shared. Under HRS, the implicit tax on the margin looks more like a quota. Think of it as converting confiscation into a predictable levy. After you meet it, you are effectively in a low-tax zone where each extra unit of effort pays you back. That shift in the slope of your personal payoff curve is what economists mean by aligning incentives. You don't need to lecture anyone about motivation. You just need to let them keep a meaningful slice of the upside. How did local carders respond? Many supported the shift because they could see the output numbers improve and the social mood lift. Meeting plan obligations became easier when households had skin in the game. And those better numbers weren't just abstract. In many places, villages retained a portion of the gains for local projects, repairing an irrigation canal, extending electricity, fixing a school roof. When the extra grain buys a transformer that lights your street, you begin to see a feedback loop between personal effort and public goods. Of course, HRS did not magically solve every problem. Land was still collectively owned. Contracts could be uncertain. And in some places, people worried about whether future policy might claw back gains. Those risks were real, but they also highlight the strength of the mechanism. Even with property rights that were incomplete by textbook standards, simply letting households keep the residual after quota unleashed practical intelligence that had been bottled up for years. Listen for the change in language that farmers used to describe their work. Instead of saying, "We fulfilled our team assignment," you hear, "Our family got the second crop in early," or "We tried a different transplanting schedule and it worked." That's not ideology. That's curiosity returning because it has a place to land. When people see that the system will not punish them for making things better, they start making things better. And others copy them. Now, what about money and prices during this period? Plan prices still existed for quota deliveries, but once households crossed that threshold, they could sell extra at negotiated prices. Those negotiated prices, even if imperfect, sent signals. Grow what people want, when they want it, and you can buy a bicycle, or a radio, or save for a milling machine. This is how a modest rule change in agriculture spills over into local markets, then into small industry. The farm becomes the first investor in the village's next act. If you're looking for a single lesson from HRS, it's this. You don't need to redesign everything at once to get big gains. You need to find the margin where effort is currently unrewarded, and then let people keep the fruit of better decisions. The rest cascades. Yields rise. Lines shorten. Time frees up. New ventures emerge. And importantly, this happens without abolishing the quota overnight or declaring a revolution on paper. It happens because a quiet contract made room for human agency. Walk with me into a township workshop in the early 1980s. The sign on the wall says collective, but the behavior inside looks suspiciously like ownership. The manager worries about orders. Workers argue, politely, about how to cut waste. The township cadre drops by, not to recite slogans, but to ask a very practical question: did we make a surplus this quarter, and can we pave the road if we did? That's the Township and Village Enterprise in a nutshell. The name says collective. The incentives say, act like owners. Here's the puzzle TVE solved. Full privatization was politically sensitive. Leaving everything inside the old state enterprise model was economically stagnant. TVEs threaded the gap. On paper, the enterprise belonged to the township or village. In practice, managers had residual control over day-to-day choices, workers were paid partly by performance, and the local government behaved less like a ministry and more like a shareholder with a long memory. If the firm did well, profits could stay local, repair the bridge, extend the power line, fund a clinic. Success translated into visible improvements that everyone could point to and say, "Our factory did that." Why did this work? Because budgets were harder than in big state firms. A TVE that missed payroll couldn't simply demand a bailout from Beijing. It had to persuade a county bank officer, or hustle more orders, or tighten costs. That created a discipline loop. Managers watched inventory. They experimented with product lines that matched nearby demand: bricks, garments, simple machinery, processed food. When a line didn't sell, they switched. No 10-year plan required. Just fast feedback. You can hear the difference in factory conversations. Instead of, "We met the tonnage target," you hear, "Our defect rate fell 3 points after we changed the die." That shift from quantity obedience to quality tinkering is what happens when a decision maker keeps a slice of the upside and faces consequences for the downside. Not theoretical property rights in a textbook, practical control over cash flow today, with community oversight tomorrow. Let's talk governance, because the wiring matters. A typical TV might have 3 anchors. First, the township government, which grants the license, negotiates land use, and expects dividends or retained earnings for local projects. Second, the manager, who has de facto autonomy to hire, fire, source inputs, and set piece rates. Third, the workforce, often recruited from the same villages, whose wages depend on output and whose families benefit when profits resurface as public goods. Is that perfect corporate law? No. But it aligns enough interests to reduce freeloading and create pride in performance. Credit was never easy. Formal banks preferred large state clients. So TVEs learned to live on short working capital cycles, get cash, buy inputs, turn them into goods, get paid, repeat. That constraint, annoying as it sounds, had an upside. It punished slow collections and sloppy procurement. It rewarded managers who built reliable buyer relationships and negotiated better terms. Tight money forced focus. Now layer in geography. TVEs flourished where roads could carry trucks to coastal ports and where local officials were willing to say yes more than no. The result wasn't one giant miracle, it was 1,000 small adjustments. One town specialized in buttons, another in zippers, another in simple motors, and suddenly you had clusters, dense networks where a buyer could source half a product within a few kilometers. Clusters compress learning time. If your neighbor figures out a cheaper cut, you hear about it by lunch. What about the social contract? Remember those dividends for the township? When the factory paid into the local budget, the village saw tangible benefits: a new transformer, a school extension, a paved access road that cut transport costs for everyone. That turned economic success into shared legitimacy. People didn't just get pay envelopes. They saw the factory's profits walking around as streetlights. But let's keep this honest. Not every TVE was clean. The same discretion that empowered good managers could enable side deals, and the line between community benefit and patronage sometimes blurred. Even so, measured against the old template, central targets, soft budgets, and no residual claim, TVEs were a different species. They had to earn the next month. That pressure, combined with the right to retain a chunk of what they earned, created a culture of constant, practical improvement. Here's a simple mental model. Think of the TVE as a bicycle with 3 balancing forces. Pedaling is market demand, stop pedaling and you fall. Steering is local governance, steer badly and you crash into corruption or useless projects. The frame is community oversight, it keeps the whole thing from wobbling apart. When those 3 forces are in rough balance, the bike moves forward fast enough that, by the mid-1990s, TVEs employed tens of millions and accounted for a large share of industrial output. Not because someone decreed a miracle, but because the rules let thousands of small decisions add up. If you want a single takeaway from TVEs, take this. Ownership is not just a title in a registry. It is the lived experience of bearing consequences and keeping rewards. TVEs recreated enough of that experience, inside a politically acceptable wrapper, that managers and workers behaved like entrepreneurs. And when everyday people behave like entrepreneurs, even modest tools and humble workshops can turn into engines of growth. Imagine if a country could carve out a few square miles and quietly change the economic physics inside the fence. That was the Special Economic Zone. In 1980, places like Shenzhen, Zhuhai, Shanqiu, and Xiamen get a different rulebook. Not a different flag, just different rules. Lower taxes. Flexible land use rights. Simpler customs. Permission to invite foreign investors who bring machines, orders, and production know-how. The rest of the country watches through the fence to see what happens. Why do zones matter? Because they turn big, abstract debates into small, measurable experiments. Instead of arguing whether new rules will work, you let a port city try them. If exports rise, if factories hire, if wages climb, you don't have to win a philosophical argument. You can point to a pay slip. That is a powerful way to lower the political risk of reform while raising the informational quality of decision-making. Inside an SEZ, the daily rhythm changes. A buyer from abroad wants a shipment next month, not next year, so the zone customs office operates on clock time rather than planned time. A plant manager can reconfigure a line without waiting for a ministry stamp because the zone regulations gave pre-approval for routine changes. A finance officer can pay for imported components and repatriate earnings on a clear schedule. These are small procedural differences that add up to one large effect: speed. And speed, coupled with predictable rules, attracts more orders and better suppliers. Land is handled differently too. Outside the fence, land use decisions are wrapped in layers of approvals. Inside, zone authorities can lease parcels quickly, assemble industrial parks, and guarantee electricity and water on a construction timeline that makes sense to a global buyer. That last point seems unromantic, but it's central. A factory is a choreography of inputs. Steel comes in here, chips there, parts over there, and the dance only works if the lights stay on and the trucks arrive. You also get a teacher that doesn't appear on a balance sheet, tacit knowledge. Foreign partners bring not just equipment, but routines. How to maintain a die so it lasts longer. How to stage inventory to reduce bottlenecks. How to design a quality check that catches defects before they multiply. Workers learn, supervisors learn, local suppliers learn. The zone becomes a school where the tuition is paid in delivered orders. Labor flows respond. Migrants from the countryside arrive with the same hands and minds they had before, but find that the new rules let them trade time and talent for rising wages. Over a few seasons, those wages buy not only better meals or a new coat, but remittances that fund a sibling's schooling or a family's first small shop back home. The zone's impact, in other words, does not stop at the fence. It radiates through family budgets, village investments, and the confidence to try new ventures. There are, of course, frictions. When rules are different inside the zone, some will try to game them, import here, ship there, arbitrage tax treatments. But the wider pattern is hard to miss. Where procedures are clear, taxes are predictable, and contracts are enforceable, cooperation scales. Buyers place larger orders. Suppliers specialize. A cluster forms around the port, each firm sharpening its niche, packaging here, fasteners there, board assembly down the road. Clusters shorten learning cycles. If one firm figures out a better process on Monday, 3 neighbors copy it by Friday. Now think about the demonstration effect. A manager in a non-zone city reads the numbers from Shenzhen and asks a simple question: what if we adopted some of their practices, even without the full legal wrapper? A provincial leader tours a humming export park and wonders how much of that could be replicated inland with a logistics upgrade. The zone is not only a factory district. It is an argument, made with data, about what rules people need to cooperate at scale. Here's a helpful analogy. The SEZ is a sandbox server in a massive multiplayer game. You adjust latency, you raise the item drop rate, you widen the map. Players pour in because the experience is smoother and the rewards are clearer. Then you watch how they play. If the new settings produce better teamwork and fewer crashes, you roll those settings into the main game. Not by decree, but because the players won't shut up about how much better it runs. The moral is quiet but sharp. When you let people negotiate prices, sign contracts they can enforce, and keep a piece of what they create, they find partners, learn faster, and build trust networks that no planner could draft on paper. The SEZ didn't win by ideology. It won by throughput. And throughput, goods out, wages up, skills compounding, is hard to argue with. Now we enter one of the strangest, most effective transitional devices you'll ever see in economic history. It's called the dual-track system. On one track, producers still owe the planner fixed quota at a low, administratively set price. On the second track, once they meet that obligation, they can sell additional output at a negotiated, market-like price. 2 prices. 1 product. Same factory. Sounds messy, right? It was. But it did something brilliant. Start with the political problem this was trying to solve. If you jump straight from full planning to full market pricing, someone loses immediately. A factory reliant on subsidized inputs might go under. A city used to cheap grain gets sticker shock. The dual track says, we won't pull the rug out from under you. Your quota at the old price still stands. But at the margin, only at the margin, we're going to let incentives work. You can produce more and sell that extra at a price that actually reflects demand. No one is forced to be a loser on day one. Meanwhile, society gets more output because producers finally have a reason to produce beyond the plan. Let's make that concrete. Imagine a steel mill obligated to deliver 100,000 tons to the plan at the old price. Under the dual track, once it ships that quota, the next ton can be sold at a negotiated price. Suddenly, the manager asks questions that used to be irrelevant. Can we squeeze another 2% throughput out of the rolling mill? Can we cut downtime by maintaining bearings on a different schedule? Because every extra ton now pays the factory, not just in political points, but in cash, effort at the margin turns into revenue. But there's a shadow side. 2 prices for the same good create room for arbitrage. If someone can get plan price steel and flip it into the market channel, they pocket a rent. That rent is the gap between the low administrative price and the higher negotiated price. Does that invite corruption? It can. And in some places it did, with middlemen or officials exploiting connections to redirect quota goods into market sales. So was dual track a mistake? Not necessarily. Think of it as buying time. The old guarantees kept social peace. The new marginal incentives pulled supply outward. Yes, there were rents. But those rents were, in a sense, the tuition paid to learn the price structure. As more output moved to the market track, the space for arbitrage narrowed. Over time, if you let the market track grow and the planned track shrink, the two tracks converge. Here's a helpful mental image. The dual track is like a two-lane bridge connecting two islands. One lane is reserved for old traffic moving at a fixed speed. The other lane allows variable speed based on conditions. At first, the fixed speed lane carries most of the cars. As drivers see the variable lane moving faster and more safely, more cars shift over, and the fixed lane becomes a smaller share of the flow. Eventually, you paint over the divider and you've got a normal road. The bridge carried you through the dangerous middle. There's also a subtle efficiency story here. For a factory manager, the quota becomes a fixed obligation, almost like a tax. What matters for decision-making is the marginal price on the market track. That marginal price says, if you figure out a way to produce one more unit, here's what you earn. Managers who can't meet the quota still have the planned safety net, but managers who innovate suddenly have a clear reward. The result is output growth without an immediate collapse of the old social contract. What about consumers? In rationed goods, people still had access at controlled prices through official channels, but the availability of market track goods meant that if you were willing to pay more, you could actually find the item. That reduces queues and the hidden cost of waiting. It also reveals information about what people value. If the market price of a certain grade of grain or a specific machine part is consistently high, that's a signal, produce more of that. Now, we have to be candid. Whenever there's a spread between two prices, people will try to capture it. Some of that is entrepreneurial energy that reallocates goods toward higher value uses. Some of it is pure influence peddling. The distinction matters. Where rules were clearer and auditing tighter, arbitrage often looked like logistics, moving goods to where they were needed and sharing the gains. Where oversight was weak, it looked like gatekeeping, diverting quota goods for private profit. Both can happen under the same policy. Institutions decide which dominates. Still, measured by outcomes, the dual-track era delivered a crucial benefit. It expanded the total pie quickly. Factories and farms had a reason to push beyond plan obligations, even as the plan fulfilled its promise to existing beneficiaries. That growth in output and choice created political space for the next steps in reform. In other words, dual-track wasn't the destination. It was the on-ramp that allowed a heavily planned system to merge, without a pile-up, onto a faster-moving road. Now we get to the rule that quietly turbocharged local ambition. In the 1980s, Beijing struck a deal with provinces and counties often called fiscal contracting. The idea was simple. Send the center a negotiated base amount of revenue. Anything you collect above that threshold? You keep a big slice. Add to that a personnel system where cadre promotions track measurable outcomes like GDP growth, fixed investment, and later foreign direct investment, and you have a powerful, if imperfect, scoreboard. Why does this matter? Because it turns development into a tournament. County A and County B are no longer just following orders, they are racing each other. If County A builds a small industrial park and lears a parts factory that expands the tax base, the county retains more revenue to pave roads, extend power lines, and claim bragging rights when provincial leaders review the ledger. Promotions begin to look like the prize at the end of a season. Did your GDP grow faster than your neighbors? Did you attract more outside capital? Did your local revenue outperform your contracted base? Step up to the next rung. Let's look at the incentive math. When a local government keeps marginal revenue, every additional unit of taxable activity is worth fighting for. That means streamlining permits, carving out land for clusters, pre-building factory shells, and, crucially, supporting the kinds of firms that actually generate cash flow. In the early years, that meant TVEs and nimble private workshops. Later, it meant courting larger investors with reliable utilities and quicker approvals. The common thread is speed. If a factory goes up this spring instead of next year, the county's bottom line looks better by winter. But a tournament has side effects. What gets measured gets managed, and what doesn't get measured can get ignored. If your promotion depends on headline GDP, you will tilt toward investment-heavy projects that immediately swell the statistics, even if the long-run returns are modest. If evaluation sheets reward visible scale, you will sometimes overbuild parks, overpromise incentives, or approve duplicative projects because they photograph well and report even better. There is also a fiscal nuance. The contracted base creates security for the center while giving localities a rising share of their own success. That's the good part. The trade-off is that places without early advantages, coastal access, transport nodes, or an entrepreneurial base, can fall behind in the tournament. To catch up, they may take riskier bets, offering deeper concessions or pushing projects that strain local balance sheets. Remember, when your scoreboard is updated every year and your career depends on it, the temptation to borrow from the future is real. Still, the upside was substantial. With marginal revenue in play, counties became problem solvers. A transformer is overloaded? Replace it. The road to the port is choked? Widen it. A supplier complains about petty delays? Assign a liaison to shepherd paperwork. These are not grand ideological gestures. They are micro-fixes that lower transaction costs. And when transaction costs fall, more deals get done. You can hear the language of the era. Officials start talking about being service-oriented. One-stop windows appear for business licenses. Timelines are posted. The unspoken logic is clear. If we make it easier to trade, build, and hire here than over the county line, we win the tournament this quarter, and maybe I win my promotion next year. That alignment, while imperfect, is better than the old world where hitting a plan quota trumped everything else. Of course, tournaments can warp behavior. If emissions or workplace safety do not feature on the scorecard, they may be downplayed. If debt is off balance sheet, it can grow in the shadows while the headline indicators sparkle. This is not unique to China, it is a general lesson about metrics. When you dangle rewards in front of human beings, they will optimize for them. The art of institutional design is choosing metrics that capture true progress and disciplining the ones that invite gaming. So what did fiscal contracting and promotion tournaments achieve? They decentralized the hunger for growth. Instead of waiting for orders from the capital, thousands of local teams experimented with the basics of economic development, infrastructure, property services, utilities, and industrial matchmaking. Some pushed too hard. Some cut corners. But many learned fast. And the country's growth numbers in the late 80s and early 90s, especially along the coast, tell you that the tournament, for all its flaws, moved the needle. Take one simple memory. A factory manager from that period might say, the county chief used to visit our line, not for a photo, but to ask, what is in your way? When rules make that question rational to ask and rewarding to answer, you've changed the culture. Not perfectly. Not forever. But enough to set the stage for the next big shift in power and finance that arrives in the mid-1990s. Now we hit a pivot that changed the money map. In 1994, China rewires its fiscal system with what's called the tax-sharing reform. The headline is simple, but the consequences run deep. Value-added tax and several buoyant revenue streams are reassigned upward to the center. Local governments still collect, but a much larger slice now flows to Beijing before anything comes back down. The message is clear. The center wants stable revenue to fund national priorities and to keep a firm hand on the purse. What does that feel like on the ground? Imagine you're a county that just spent a decade learning to sprint under fiscal contracting. You streamlined permits, built industrial parks, and your local tax take finally started to grow. Overnight, a bigger portion of every fresh yuan you collect is no longer yours to keep. Transfers will arrive later, with conditions. Your ambitions did not shrink, but your discretionary cash did. So you look for a new margin to push. And you find it in land. Here's the mechanism. Local governments do not own land privately, but they do control land use. Convert farmland at the edge of town into construction land, auction the use rights to a developer, and you get a large, upfront payment known as a land conveyance fee. Unlike shared taxes, these fees feel local, fast, and flexible. They can be steered into roads, subways, parks, and, crucially, into the matching funds you need to unlock bank lending for bigger projects. A growth machine reboots on a new fuel. But big, lumpy projects require more than one-off auction proceeds. Enter the local government financing vehicle, or LGFV. Think of an LGFV as a city's off-budget holding company. It takes the land use rights as collateral, borrows from state-linked banks or trust products, and pours the funds into infrastructure, bridges, ring roads, industrial parks. On paper, it is separate from the city's formal budget. In practice, everyone assumes the city stands behind it. That assumption lowers the interest rate today, while moving risk out of the main books until tomorrow. You can see how the incentives line up. After 1994, if you want to keep pace in the development tournament but you have less tax revenue under your own control, you will lean harder on assets you can monetize locally. Land becomes a piggy bank. Infrastructure becomes both a necessity and a statistic. Build it, and the GDP number clicks upward. Sell the next parcel around the new station, and the cash wheel turns again. This model produced real improvements. Cities got roads that cut travel times in half, wastewater plants that cleaned rivers, transit lines that connected workers to jobs. Those are not illusions, they change daily life. But the same model also produced a pattern you should notice. When land prices rise, collateral looks stronger, borrowing expands, and projects multiply. When land prices soften, collateral weakens, rollover risks grow, and suddenly yesterday's ribbon cutting becomes today's refinancing headache. There is a deeper shift beneath the spreadsheets. Before 1994, the center had loosened its grip to let local initiative blossom. After 1994, the center's claim on the tax base strengthened, and localities learned to operate in the gray space between formal budgets and asset-backed entities. In other words, re-centralization did not end local activism. It changed the channels through which that activism flowed, away from shared taxes, toward land-driven finance and quasi-fiscal credit. Consider the time profile of the benefits and the costs. The benefits, jobs, visible infrastructure, headline GDP, arrive early. The costs, debt service, maintenance obligations, vulnerability to land cycles, arrive later. When political evaluation horizons are short, that timing difference can tilt decisions toward projects that look good this term and leave harder questions to the next one. No conspiracy required. Just the quiet arithmetic of incentives. If you're looking for one clean sentence to carry forward, take this. The 1994 tax sharing reform re-centralized revenue and pushed localities to fund growth with land and leverage. It worked, for a time, because it aligned with the scoreboard and satisfied real needs. But it also set the stage for balance sheet pressures that would surface whenever land values or credit conditions turned. By the mid to late 1990s, reformers face a hard truth. Many large state firms are bleeding cash, many small ones are drifting, and the banking system is stuffed with loans that were made for policy reasons rather than commercial ones. The slogan that emerges is simple to say and brutal to implement: grasp the large, let go the small. In plain language, consolidate and protect the strategically important enterprises, and either restructure, merge, lease out, or shut down the rest. What does this look like up close? In a heavy industry SOE, the leadership team is told to tighten operations, shed non-core activities like housing and schools, and focus on a few lines where the firm might actually be globally competitive. In a smaller, perpetually loss-making plant, the instruction is more final: find a buyer, spin off as a collective or private firm, or close. That last option creates real human pain. Tens of millions of workers are laid off or retired early, often with buyout packages that look adequate on paper but feel thin against the reality of finding new work in a changing economy. It is a reminder that efficiency gains are never just numbers. They land on people. Parallel to this, the state cleans up the banking system's balance sheets. Remember, for years banks extended credit based on plan priorities. When the old priority customer could not pay, the loan didn't disappear, it sat, aging into a non-performing loan. The fix that takes shape is institutional. New asset management companies, AMCs, are created to purchase bad loans from the big state banks at negotiated discounts. The idea is to take the rot out of the core and work it out elsewhere over time. That move doesn't create wealth, but it does create breathing room for the banks to lend again without dragging the old anchors forward. Now, here's the part that determines behavior for years to come. Even after consolidation and cleanup, strategic SOEs retain privileged access to credit. Why? Because they are large employers, sit in politically important sectors, and are widely presumed to have an implicit guarantee. A banker learns, sometimes explicitly and sometimes by osmosis, that lending to a big state firm is safer for one's career than backing a scrappy private competitor, even if the latter's return on capital looks better. That is not a market judgment. That is a risk of career judgment. What happens to private firms and the TVE successes in that world? Many grow anyway, but they often do so outside the main arteries of formal finance. They rely on retained earnings, supplier credit, trade finance tied to orders, and local networks that mobilize short-term loans at high turnover. In places like Wenzhou, you see elaborate informal credit markets arise, rotating pools, trust-based lending, and contract practices that function because reputation costs are real and quick. This ecosystem is inventive and fast, but it is also exposed. When a downturn hits or a scandal freezes trust, funding can evaporate quickly. The credit segmentation shows up on factory floors. An SOE can afford a big, long gestation project with a modest expected return because the loan rollovers are plausible and the downside is cushioned. A private firm with the same idea will think twice, not because it lacks courage, but because a single bad bet can be fatal. So the private firm specializes in short-cycle products, incremental process improvements, and niches where cash conversion is fast. That specialization produces impressive productivity gains, but it also means some long-horizon innovations cluster where the softest budgets live. Was the consolidation worth it? In some sectors, yes. Streamlined SOEs did become globally relevant, especially where scale and coordination mattered. The macro data show productivity rising and fiscal drains shrinking. Yet the system also locked in a pattern: strategic borrowers with cheap, patient credit on one side, nimble private producers with expensive, impatient capital on the other. That pattern shaped who could take what kind of risk. If you want a simple mechanism to carry forward, here it is. Credit is a policy dial as much as it is a market outcome. When the dial favors entities with implicit guarantees, you get investment patterns that make political sense even when they do not maximize value. When the dial is closed to small, high-return projects because they are noisier or harder to monitor, you risk leaving growth on the table. People respond to the price of money just as they respond to the price of steel or grain. When money is cheapest where losses can be socialized and dearest where gains would be privatized by new entrants, you can guess where concrete will pour. None of this requires cynicism. It requires observation. The late 1990s reformers stabilized banks, slimmed the state's industrial footprint, and kept strategic industries intact. At the same time, they embedded a credit hierarchy that the most energetic private firms learned to work around rather than through. That workaround culture, retained earnings, fast cash cycles, reputation-based credit, kept dynamism alive. But it also left a question hanging in the air that will matter for everything that follows. If the best ideas often live where the budgets are hardest, what would change if the price of money reflected that fact more cleanly? The calendar flips to 2001, and a new kind of contract is signed. China enters the World Trade Organization. Now, this isn't just about joining a club. It is about binding yourself to a rulebook that limits unilateral backtracking. Tariffs are cut on a schedule. Quotas turn into tariff rate quotas that phase down. Intellectual property commitments tighten. Behind the acronyms is a simple proposition: in exchange for predictable access to global markets, you promise predictable treatment for traders and investors at home. What changes on the ground? First, the signal to private firms becomes louder. If you can meet international standards, there will be buyers. Everywhere. That certainty is oxygen. A parts maker who once sold to 3 domestic clients now gets inquiries from a Korean assembler and a German distributor. The order volumes rise, but more importantly, the specifications harden. Tolerances narrow. Delivery windows shrink. Documentation thickens. It is demanding, sometimes brutally so, but it teaches. Second, supply chains rewire themselves around comparative strengths. Coastal cities that already had ports and SEZ experience become assembly hubs. Components flow in from East Asia, value is added onshore, finished goods flow out. Upstream, inland factories expand to supply materials and sub-assemblies. Downstream, logistics firms, testing labs, and packaging specialists multiply. Think of it as an industrial network turning from a series of local roads into an expressway system. There's a monetary financial angle you can't see from a loading dock. As exports surge and foreign direct investment pours in, foreign currency accumulates. To prevent the exchange rate from lurching upward too fast, the central bank sterilizes, absorbing liquidity by issuing its own bills or raising reserve requirements. The policy goal is stability, but the side effect is an expanding balance sheet and, at times, cheap funding for favored borrowers. Again, incentives, money becomes plentiful for some projects and scarce for others, shaping which parts of the economy accelerate. Household experience changes too. Jobs in export zones pay cash wages that rise with skill and speed. Skills compound quickly because a worker who masters one step can often move to a higher step or switch to a neighboring factory for a better rate. Over a few seasons, a migrant sends remittances home, funds a sibling's education, maybe buys a stake in a small shop. That's the micro story the macro statistics can't narrate, but it is the engine of social mobility that many families remember. But there are imbalances to track. Successful exporters cluster along the coast where ports, buyers, and dense supplier networks live. The interior grows, but more slowly, and the gap becomes a political fact as much as an economic one. Environmental pressures intensify, particularly in heavy industry and along rivers where untreated effluents once slid by unnoticed. And the external accounts swell. The current account surplus climbs, which in international politics becomes a magnet for scrutiny and friction. When you sell far more than you buy, someone else is absorbing the difference. Inside firms, the discipline of global competition does something valuable. It forces process improvements that a purely domestic market might tolerate without. Six Sigma stops being a buzzword and becomes a way to win a contract. Managers who once shrugged at a 2% defect rate start chasing 0.5% and then 1/4 because that is the difference between repeat orders and a cancelled line. Knowledge diffuses down the supply chain. The smallest shop learns to calibrate a jig because the biggest buyer will reject a shipment that is off by a millimeter. There is also a subtle cultural change. Contracts and standards, boring words, become carriers of trust. A supplier learns that if a clause says net 30, payment arrives in 30. A buyer learns that if a box says 1,000 units, there are 1,000 units. When these rhythms become reliable, you can scale cooperation with strangers. That is not a uniquely Chinese lesson. It is the general logic of trade. But after WTO entry, it clicks at a new speed and scope. Still, gains come with trade-offs. When the exchange rate is managed to keep export stability, households may see imported goods cheaper than they would otherwise be, but savers might face low returns at home. When global demand dips, export hubs feel the chill instantly, while inland regions that rely on those remittances feel it a season later. The system's strengths, speed, scale, specialization, also become channels through which global shocks travel fast. If you want the essence, here it is. WTO entry locked in rules that rewarded firms capable of delivering quality at scale on time. That lock-in amplified the advantages of places already wired for speed, drew capital and talent toward clusters, and pushed a generation of managers and workers to learn the world's playbook. It also magnified regional differences, environmental strains, and the macro arithmetic of large surpluses and active sterilization. None of this is mystical. It is what happens when you plug a big, newly experimental economy into a demanding global grid. A global financial storm hits. Orders from abroad slow, containers sit idle, and export factories feel a sudden draft. In late 2008, China answers with speed and scale. Policy banks open the spigots. State-owned banks expand credit. Local governments, often through their financing vehicles, roll out lists of projects that have been sitting in drawers waiting for green lights. Bridges, subways, ring roads, water plants, social housing, industrial parks. The goal is simple to say and complex to manage: stabilize employment and investment before the chill becomes a freeze. How does this actually work in the plumbing? A city's local government financing vehicle, or LGFV, takes land use rights and projected cash flows from future fees or leases and posts them as collateral. Banks, with guidance to support growth, lend against those assets. Construction companies mobilize crews. Steel mills ramp back up. Cement kilns fire. Money turns into motion very quickly because the institutional channels built after 1994 are already in place. Think of it as a fire hose aimed at demand shortfalls. The short-run effects are visible from space. Nighttime lights brighten along new expressways. Urban rail lines carve through city maps that used to be blank. Logistics improve. Commutes shrink. Contractors hire workers who might otherwise have returned to villages without paychecks. For households, this matters. A steady wage beats a pink slip, and a new metro line that halves travel time is not an abstraction, it is an hour of life returned each day. But every emergency tool has a price tag stamped on the back. When an LGFV funds a viaduct or a wastewater plant, it also inherits a stream of obligations: principal, interest, maintenance. If the paired land sales around the project continue briskly, or if user fees materialize as planned, the wheel turns. If land softens or fees disappoint, rollover risk grows. To ease pressure, new credit channels appear in the shadow: trust products, wealth management products, and other vehicles that promise yield to savers and funnel money into projects that still look good on paper. This is where incentives matter more than slogans. Cadre scorecards remain oriented to growth and visible build-out. If you can open a park next year instead of 3 years from now, that ribbon helps your evaluation. If the debt that funded it matures in 5 or 7 years, that is another person's problem. No malice required. It is the time profile of benefits and costs doing what it always does in political systems: pull attention toward the now. There is also a macro-financial loop to notice. As bank credit grows rapidly, the central bank tries to manage liquidity and inflation expectations. Tools like higher reserve requirements or targeted window guidance steer flows without slamming the brakes. That partial braking can create uneven pressure. Favored borrowers continue to access funds, while smaller private firms without collateral that pleases banks get squeezed, even if their projects yield more per yuan lent. The result is stabilization with a tilt, concrete-heavy projects surge, while some entrepreneurial ventures hunt for oxygen. None of this is to deny the real gains. The post-2008 build-out improved life in countless ways. Cities got safer water, faster transit, and flood defenses that, years later, would quietly protect neighborhoods during storms that once would have been disasters. But the balance sheets lengthened. By the mid-2010s, analysts were counting not only bridges but maturities, not only tunnels but refinancing calendars. A generation of local officials learned to manage not just construction schedules but debt pyramids, juggling bank loans, trust products, and land auctions to keep the carousel turning. The social texture shifted as well. Construction absorbed migrants at scale, then released them when cycles turned. Some workers moved from factory lines to job sites and back again, adapting as the policy wind shifted. Households felt both the benefits of new infrastructure and the anxiety of rising housing costs tied to the land-centric model that underwrote much of the stimulus flow. If you want the essence of this slide in one breath, here it is. The 2008 response harnessed state banks and local financing vehicles to trade future cash flows for present stability. It worked in the short run and built assets that many citizens still use daily. It also layered leverage onto local balance sheets and widened the gap between borrowers with implicit support and firms that live or die by cash flow. When the next shock arrives, that layered structure determines who bends and who breaks. Let's pull the threads together carefully and see the pattern in the fabric. We've watched bottom-up experiments, household contracts, township enterprises, special zones, change behavior by letting people keep a meaningful share of what they create. We've also watched top-down targets, dual-track quotas, promotion scorecards, tax recentralization, and credit guidance mobilize resources quickly while bending choices toward what the scoreboard rewards. Same country, same era. Two different ways of steering human effort. Start with the bottom-up side. When households could keep the residual after quota, they experimented, not because a poster told them to, but because the arithmetic finally made sense. When township enterprises faced harder budgets and could retain profits locally, managers iterated on process and product because the feedback loop was tight and personal. When special zones offered predictable rules, contracts, and customs, people coordinated at a scale that lectures cannot produce, orders arrived, skills compounded, wages rose. In each case, decision rights and rewards were reattached. The person who bore the risk could also touch the gain. That alignment turned curiosity into action. Now look at the top-down side. Targets and recentralization brought speed and scale. A dual-track system grew output without creating instant losers, cadre tournaments got roads paved fast, tax sharing gave the center the revenue it wanted for national priorities, directed credit built big platforms in strategic sectors. Those tools worked on their own terms. But they carried familiar side effects. Two prices for the same good made rents. A scoreboard built on GDP and fixed investment made overbuilding rational. Recentralized taxes pushed localities toward land finance and leverage, a path that shines early and shadows later. Privileged credit insulated some projects from discipline and starved others that might have delivered more per unit of capital. Here is a useful way to visualize it. Imagine two chains. The bottom-up chain runs rules to incentives to behavior to outcomes. The rules grant residual claim and clear exit. The incentive is keep what you build and learn fast from what you break. The behavior is tinkering, price discovery, local problem solving. The outcome is productivity growth that feels earned. The top-down chain runs targets to reports to mobilization to outcomes. The targets define success, the reports translate it into a score, mobilization moves concrete and credit toward the metric. The outcome is visible scale, achieved quickly, with the risk that hidden costs arrive on a delay. Notice the moral texture hiding in the mechanics. In bottom-up systems, failure tends to be smaller and instructive. A workshop tries a line, the market yawns, the workshop pivots. Painful, yes, but bounded, and the lesson spreads through the cluster by gossip and example. In top-down pushes, failure can be larger and delayed. A park gets built because it photographs well and ticks a box. The ribbon is cut. The refinancing comes later. When the bill finally shows up, it lands on people who never attended the ribbon cutting. This isn't an argument for chaos or against coordination. It is a reminder that coordination without feedback is theater. The bottom-up cases we saw were not anarchic, they were embedded in communities, policed by reputations, and often overseen by local councils that could say no. The distinction that mattered was whether the person making the decision could feel the edge of a hard budget and taste the upside of a good bet. Where that was true, innovation looked like common sense. Where it wasn't, innovation looked like a risk to one's career, and the safest path was to hit the target with a project large enough to be noticed. There's a quiet lesson about measurement here. Good metrics illuminate, bad metrics seduce. When a zone posts on-time delivery rates that buyers can verify, firms improve the thing that actually matters. When a county posts headline GDP and hides debt in an off-budget entity, the metric becomes a costume. People are not fools. They will dress to impress the measure they believe will move their lives. So what do we carry forward from this comparison? First, residual claim and decision rights belong together. Separate them and you get apathy at the edge and lobbying at the center. Second, budgets should teach quickly. If losses are socialized and gains are private for the well-connected, the game tilts toward projects that look safe on paper and wilt in reality. Third, permission to try small and scale what works beats grand designs that forbid failure. A system that can say that didn't work, stop, costs less than one that can only say forge ahead. None of this requires a manifesto. It requires institutional modesty. Let the farmer keep more after the quota and watch yields rise. Let the workshop keep cash flow and watch quality creep up. Let the zone enforce simple, predictable procedures and watch strangers cooperate. Then, when you must mobilize from the top, because floods come, or global demand falls, use tools that sunset themselves, publish the full cost, and keep the path back to hard budgets open. The evidence we've covered is not a morality play about heroes and villains. It is a map of how rules become habits, how habits become systems, and how systems shape the lives of millions. Bottom-up experiments didn't work because people became better. They worked because the rules stopped punishing better. Top-down targets didn't misfire because people became worse. They misfired where the rules rewarded appearances over truth. If we can see that clearly, the next steps in our story practically write themselves. Let's step off the policy stage and walk through places where discretion plus hard budgets actually lived. Picture Wenchu's shoe clusters, Yiwu's trading stalls, Dongguan's contract manufacturing belts. None of these began with perfect statutes or glossy plans. They began with people solving immediate problems under rules that let them keep the upside and force them to eat the downside. Start with the neighborhood scale. A workshop buys one used machine and wins a tiny order. Cash is tight, so every decision is a trade-off you can feel. Do we buy higher-grade steel that reduces defects, or save money and risk rework? The answer writes itself when tomorrow's payroll depends on today's quality. That pressure isn't cruelty, it's clarity. When budgets are hard, waste hurts, and learning pays in days, not years. Clusters sharpen that learning. In a dense district, you can find a die maker 5 blocks away, a packaging shop around the corner, a maintenance wizard who can rebuild a motor with parts scavenged from 2 others. If you change a process and your defect rate drops, your neighbor will hear by lunch and copy it by dinner. That gossip network is an economic engine. It moves information faster than any circular. Notice how credit behaves here. Formal bank loans are rare for small players. So firms rely on retained earnings, supplier credit, customer deposits, and reputation-based loans inside the cluster. Reputation is collateral. Pay late once and 7 vendors will hear before the week ends. Pay promptly and someone will extend you terms when a big order lands. That's not romantic. It is a decentralized enforcement system that rewards reliability without waiting for a distant office to adjudicate a contract. Local governments in these places often acted like pragmatic referees. They cleared markets for weekend trading, standardized stall sizes, posted simple rules, and then stayed out of the way except to fix obvious bottlenecks, extend a feeder road, add a substation, open a one-stop window for licenses. The unwritten pact was straightforward. We will make it easy to trade, and you will generate the tax base that keeps the lights on. Neither side needed a manifesto. They needed predictability. Property rights were imperfect on paper but meaningful in practice. A township might still hold the land, but long leases and consistent renewals gave entrepreneurs enough horizon to invest. A manager might not have a title deed to a factory shell, but if everyone knew this was her line and her equipment, the social cost of expropriating it was high. Informal rights, when widely recognized and backed by quick dispute resolution, can be surprisingly durable. What about the human side? Decentralized spaces turned workers into learners. A line operator who mastered one station could move up the ladder or hop across the alley to a better shop. Skill ladders were short and real. A foreman who figured out a new jig could start a side shop with 2 friends and a rented room. That mobility didn't require a central committee's permission. It required doorways that were open and rules that didn't slam them shut. Let's be honest about the limits. Informal systems can exclude outsiders who lack connections, and they can spiral when a shock hits and trust freezes. But compared to systems where credit is allocated by status and projects are chosen to please a scoreboard, these decentralized alternatives have a different failure mode. They tend to fail small. And small failures teach. The workshop that overexpanded closes a bay, not a city. The trader who overextended sits out a season, not a decade. Those losses sting, but they do not metastasize into a balance sheet crisis that forces everyone into a refinancing queue. Now consider the counterfactuals. What if rural land use rights had been clearer earlier, with portable contracts that let households lease or mortgage plots transparently? You likely would have seen capital pool more efficiently into the best hands without the grey channels that later became flashpoints. What if private firms had gained cleaner access to long-term credit earlier? Some of the deep tech and capital goods moves that clustered in protected zones might have been contested by entrepreneurs with different risk profiles. Not to replace coordination, but to make sure coordination had challenges. Here is the through line that ties these cases together. When rules are simple, budgets are hard, and decision makers keep a slice of what they create, people self-organize into networks that look chaotic from far away and beautifully ordered up close. Quality improves because the neighbor will outcompete you if it doesn't. Prices reflect scarcity because no one is obligated to sell below cost. Trust builds because the cost of breaking it arrives tomorrow morning, not in a distant audit next year. If you're looking for one practical principle to carry forward, take this. Build systems where the smallest unit, household, workshop, store, can try, fail, and try again without asking for permission or a subsidy. Then make it easy for winners to scale by clearing the frictions only government can clear: titles, electricity, roads, ports, and predictable, fast dispute resolution. Do that, and you don't have to pick champions. They will pick themselves. Let's pull back and look at the arc. What actually moved the needle in China's reform era? Not slogans. Not perfect blueprints. It was rule changes that reattached effort to outcome, and consequence to choice. When households kept the residual after quota, curiosity came roaring back. When township enterprises faced hard budgets and kept local profits, managers became problem solvers. When special zones made contracts predictable and timelines real, strangers cooperated at scale. None of that required a conversion experience. It required rules that stopped punishing better decisions. Now turn the lens the other way. Top-down targets mobilized resources with breathtaking speed, but they also carried familiar distortions. Dual-track pricing grew output while paying tuition in the form of rents. Promotion tournaments rewarded visible growth and sometimes encouraged overbuilding. The 1994 tax-sharing reform stabilized central revenue but nudged local governments toward land finance and leverage, benefits now, bills later. Credit preferences protected strategic giants and left many smaller, higher-return projects to fend for themselves. These are not moral failings. They are the predictable footprints of incentives. So what do we actually learn here? First, decision rights and residual claims belong together. Separate them, and you will get queues, quotas, and quiet workarounds. Join them, and you get tinkering, quality improvements, and faster learning cycles. Second, budgets should teach quickly. Systems that cushion losses for favored players and delay accounting are inviting tomorrow's headaches. Third, permission to try small, then scale what works, is stronger than an ornate plan that forbids failure. Experiments are cheap teachers, rescues are expensive ones. There's also a human thread worth naming. Bottom-up mechanisms tend to fail locally and instructively. A shop pivots, a farmer shifts planting, a zone quietly revises a procedure. Top-down pushes tend to succeed or fail spectacularly, with costs that arrive on a delay and land on people who did not sign the paperwork. Which pattern would you rather live under? Which one better preserves dignity and agency while still allowing coordination when you need it? If you're looking for design principles you can carry into any system, take these 5. Clear, tradable rights so people can plan beyond the season. Transparent prices so scarcity speaks honestly. Fiscal discipline that keeps today's ribbon from becoming tomorrow's refinancing meeting. Contestable finance so ideas compete for capital on results, not relationships. And fast, predictable dispute resolution so trust scales beyond your cousin's cousin. Notice what's missing from that list. No grand ideology. No promise that a committee will always know best. Just a quiet confidence that when adults are allowed to keep a share of what they create, and must carry a share of what they break, they will generally choose better than distant scorecards can guess. That confidence is not naive. It's historical. Now, if you found this way of looking at history useful, where we let the documents and the data speak, and we follow incentives wherever they lead, do me a favor. Like the video, drop a comment with the most surprising insight you're taking away, and subscribe for more deep dives that are both rigorous and human. If you want to go deeper, check out my book, History They Tried to Erase. The link is in the description. And if you enjoy thoughtful, entertaining history told with receipts and a little humor, explore the other videos on this channel. There's a lot more to uncover, and I'd love to have you along for the next turn in the story.